Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, imagine you spend your entire life trying to save your community from utter catastrophic collapse.
Right.
You act as their guide, their protector, their advocate, and when the dust finally settles and you ask for your wages, just a simple acknowledgement of the value you've provided, they hand you exactly the ancient market price of a dead slave.
Oh, man.
I mean, it is the ultimate calculating insult. And 2.5 millennia ago, an ancient visionary actually predicted exactly that payout for a leader who tried to stop a war.
Yeah, it's one of the most jarring, economically devastating metaphors in all of ancient literature, really.
Yeah.
And it's just one small piece of a much larger, incredibly complex puzzle.
Exactly. So today, our mission in this deep dive is to explore the ancient, apocalyptic, and deeply poetic text of the Bible book of Zechariah, specifically chapters 9 through 14. We have a formidable stack of sources on the table to help us navigate this. We're looking at the World English Bible translation of the original text, Albert Barnes's incredibly detailed historical and contextual notes, and Matthew Henry's extensive, deeply analytical commentary on the psychology and theology of the book.
And we want to be very clear right up front. We are not here to give you a dry theological lecture. We aren't going to just read dates and names like a museum placard.
Please no.
Right. The sheer beauty of these specific sources Barnes and Henry applied to Zechariah is that they reveal the absolute underlying mechanics of human nature. Like they show us how societies fracture, how power corrupts, and how hope operates in a vacuum.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we are acting as your thoughtful guides today. We want to help you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the immediate life application from a text written, millennia ago.
Because it's still so relevant.
It really is, because if you are listening to this right now and you are existing in the modern world, you are likely facing some level of profound anxiety. Maybe you're watching massive institutions fail, or you are dealing with toxic, extractive leadership in your own workplace. Or perhaps you're just battling a creeping, quiet sense of hopelessness about the overall trajectory of the world.
Which is super common right now.
Right. So we promise you, this deep dive is going to uncover some surprising, counterintuitive, and highly relevant ancient strategies for dealing with exactly those issues.
But to understand the solutions, though, we first have to thoroughly understand the problem. We really have to start with the context of the chaos.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So let's look at the historical stage. According to both Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry, we are looking at roughly 510 BC. The Jewish people are what historians call post-exilic.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that term, post-exilic, because it sounds so academic, but the human reality of it is staggering.
Oh, it really is.
This basically means they have finally returned to their homeland, to Jerusalem, after a brutal 70-year captivity in Babylon.
Correct. And a 70-year gap means that almost no one returning to Jerusalem actually remembers it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right. The people who were deported as adults are dead. The people returning are the children and grandchildren of the exiles.
So it's all just stories to them.
Exactly. They have grown up hearing stories of a magnificent golden city, a glorious temple, a powerful sovereign state. They're carrying the immense weight of intergenerational expectations.
Right. So they finally make the treacherous journey back across the desert. And what do they find? Rubble? Scorched earth?
Just completely decimated infrastructure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you are a refugee, and your family has been talking for decades about the glorious family estate that was stolen from you.
Yeah.
You spend your entire life savings, you risk your life to win it back, and when you finally get the keys and open the door, the foundation is cracked, the roof is caved in, and the well is poisoned.
The return wasn't the triumphant fairy tale they expected. It was a waking nightmare of vulnerability.
It should have been a time of absolute triumph. But instead, they find themselves as a tiny, impoverished, fragile community trying to stack rocks on top of each other. And they're surrounded by incredibly powerful, threatening neighbors.
And this is where Albert Barnes's historical notes are just invaluable.
They really are. He paints the geopolitical landscape that Zechariah is speaking into perfectly. To the north, you have Syria, with its ancient metropolis of Damascus. Then you have the Phoenician powerhouses, Tyre and Sidon.
And Tyre wasn't just a city. I mean, it was a massive maritime superpower.
Exactly. Zechariah specifically points out Tyre's sheer arrogance. The text says Tyre has built herself a stronghold and heaped up silver like the dust and fine gold like the mire of the streets.
Like mud. They had so much gold, it was like mud in the streets.
Yeah, it's wild. And Barnes explains that Tyre was literally an island fortress. They looked at the geopolitical instability of the mainland and built their citadel out in the ocean, surrounded by massive walls plunging directly into the sea.
That is intense.
They controlled the Mediterranean trade routes. They believed their geographic isolation and their infinite wealth made them completely untouchable.
And then to the south, you have the Philistines, right? The text mentions cities like Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod.
Yep.
And these are entrenched, hostile military states that have been a thorn in the side of the region for centuries.
Oh, absolutely.
So you are this returning group of refugees sitting in the ruined bowl of Jerusalem, and you are surrounded by heavily armed, hyper-wealthy nations who view you as an easy target. I mean, it is a geopolitical powder keg.
But this is where the prophet Zechariah introduces a radical disruption to their fear. He delivers a prophecy that completely upends the expected geopolitical outcome.
What does he say?
He says that God will protect his house against the army and that no oppressor will pass through them anymore. And he specifically targets those powerful neighbors. He says the power of Tyre will be smitten in the sea and that the Philistine cities will be stripped of their pride.
And the historical fulfillment of this, as Matthew Henry points out in his commentary, is absolutely fascinating.
It's mind-blowing.
Henry aligns these specific prophecies historically with the conquests of Alexander the Great, which happened a couple of centuries later. Alexander the Great sweeps through the ancient Near East like an unstoppable force of nature.
And look at how he deals with Tyre. Tyre thought their island fortress made them safe from a land army. So what does Alexander do?
He builds a bridge, doesn't he?
Oh, more than a bridge. He spends 7 months literally tearing down the ruins of the old mainland city of Tyre, throwing the stones, the timber, and the very dirt into the ocean to build a massive half-mile causeway out to the island.
Wow.
He turns the sea into dry land just to crush them. He absolutely ravages the Phoenician coast and marches down to conquer the Philistine cities like Gaza.
And here's the wildest part of the historical record. He marches his unstoppable war machine right past Jerusalem. Historically, the accounts say he actually showed reverence to the high priest in Jerusalem and spared the city entirely. The surrounding superpowers, who relied on their massive wealth, their ocean fortresses, and their military alliances, were completely pulverized.
But the fragile, vulnerable city that had no physical walls to speak of was mysteriously protected.
It's crazy.
It really proves the profound illusion of relying purely on material wealth and fortified walls for ultimate security. Zechariah is trying to teach the people that external material dominance is incredibly fragile.
Right?
The strongholds we build to protect ourselves, whether they are literal stone walls in the ocean or financial fortresses or aggressive corporate strategies, can be dismantled by a shift in the winds of history.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Zechariah doesn't just focus on the external threats. He doesn't just look at the empires outside the walls. In chapter 11, the camera of the prophecy pivots sharply, violently inward. The existential threat to the community isn't just the Syrians or the Greeks or the Philistines. The most terrifying threat is actually coming from inside the house.
Yes. The transition from the external threat to the internal rot. Zechariah 11 introduces this chilling, deeply disturbing concept of the flock of slaughter.
The flock of slaughter, so grim.
Very grim. God tells the prophet to act out the role of a shepherd and feed this flock. And the text describes the leaders of this society in a way that should make anyone who understands institutional power shudder.
What does it say?
It says, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty. And they that sell them say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich. And their own shepherds don't pity them.
That is a devastating psychological portrait of institutional failure. Zechariah calls out what he translates as the worthless or foolish shepherd.
Yeah.
And I really want to look at the specific mechanisms of this leader's failure, as described in verses 15 through 17. The text lists exactly what this leader refuses to do.
Right. It's a list of negations.
This leader does not visit those who are cut off. They do not seek out the scattered. They do not heal the broken. They do not feed the healthy.
It is an absolute abdication of the core function of leadership. A shepherd's literal job description is to maintain the cohesion and the health of the flock.
But it gets worse. It's not just passive neglect. It's active systemic extraction. What does this foolish shepherd actually do? The text says they eat the meat of the fat sheep and tear their hooves in pieces.
Ugh. What's fascinating here is how Matthew Henry analyzes the sociology of this passage. He connects these ancient shepherds to the later religious and political leaders of Christ's time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Oh, interesting.
He points out that these leaders were supposed to be the spiritual and moral protectors of the people. Instead, they had engineered a system where they fleeced their own flock for their personal gain.
They became parasites.
Exactly. The text is describing a leadership model, a corporate or institutional culture, really, where the people at the bottom are viewed entirely as resources to be consumed by the people at the top, rather than humans to be cared for.
Right.
The true shepherd is supposed to lay down his life for the sheep. The toxic shepherd slaughters the sheep to pad his own life.
It's institutional cannibalism. And Henry notes something incredibly insidious about how these leaders operate. They actually justify their oppression with religious or moral language.
Yes.
They say, "Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich." They are monetizing their abuse and then slapping a divine endorsement on it. They equate their personal prosperity with God's favor, completely, intentionally ignoring the fact that their prosperity is built directly on the broken backs of the people they were entrusted to protect.
I mean, it is the ultimate rationalization of greed. They use the language of blessing to cover the mechanics of exploitation. Now, as we dive into this, we need to apply a vital rule of wisdom with discernment. We are exploring a text that describes ancient theocratic and religious structures, and it is crucial to state clearly that we're taking no sides in modern political debates here today. We're impartially reporting on the ancient text's clear, uncompromising condemnation of leaders who exploit their people.
Right. We're just reading what's there.
Exactly. But the core wisdom here, the psychological profile of the foolish shepherd, speaks to a universal human experience of corrupt, self-serving power. Whether we are analyzing an ancient monarch, a feudal lord, a 19th century industrial baron, or a modern corporate executive running a leveraged buyout, the fundamental psychology remains exactly the same.
Absolutely. The mechanism transcends its era entirely. When a leader prioritizes their own extraction over the integrity of the system becomes a flock of slaughter.
Yeah.
And this gives us our first major practical takeaway for you, the listener. We want you to elevate your view and audit the systems of leadership in your own life right now. Think about your workplace, your community organizations, the institutions you support, or any hierarchy you exist within. What are the actual mechanics of their leadership? Are you following a leader who structurally heals the broken, who seeks out the marginalized, who nurtures the long-term health of the team? Or are you trapped, working for a foolish shepherd who only eats the fat of the sheep?
Someone who just extracts.
Right, someone who takes credit for your intellectual property, burns out the staff to hit quarterly metrics, and views your exhaustion merely as a necessary input for their own bonus.
And we can't just point fingers upward. This demands a deeply uncomfortable mirror for self-reflection. If you are in any position of leadership, whether you are a mid-level manager of 5 people, the CEO of a company, or simply leading a family unit, which shepherd are you embodying?
Oh, that's tough.
When someone in your care is broken, when they are struggling or underperforming due to life circumstances, is your baseline instinct to heal them, to invest the time to repair the fracture? Or is your instinct to discard them, to write them off because they are no longer producing meat for your bottom line?
That is a heavy, heavy question. If we are honest, our modern hustle culture heavily incentivizes being the foolish shepherd. We are rewarded for extraction. But Zechariah doesn't just leave us staring into the abyss of toxic leadership. He doesn't just diagnose the disease. He introduces a radical, deeply uncomfortable alternative. And this brings us to part 2 of our deep dive, the radical reversal of power.
Okay, let's get into it.
Because right in the middle of all this geopolitical terror from empires like Tyre and the internal corruption of the foolish shepherds, Zechariah chapter 9 drops one of the most famous and frankly completely counterintuitive images in all of ancient literature.
We're referring to Zechariah 9, verse 9.
Oh, yeah.
It reads, "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He is righteous and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey."
Yes. Let's pull that apart, because to a modern reader, a king arriving on a donkey sounds like a scene from a children's story or maybe a satire. It doesn't sound like a serious geopolitical strategy.
Not at all.
But we have to understand the specific symbols of power in the ancient Near East to grasp what is actually happening here.
It is a profound, deliberate contrast. Think about the landscape we just mapped out. Tyre built a massive stronghold, The empires around them relied entirely on the chariot and the battle bow.
Right.
The ultimate currency of power, the nuclear weapon of the ancient world, was the war horse. A conquering king returning from a victorious campaign would ride a magnificent, towering, armored stallion. He would be flanked by chariots, projecting overwhelming brute force, dominance, and the threat of extreme violence.
But this promised king, this leader who is supposed to bring salvation to a traumatized, vulnerable people, comes riding a donkey, a colt, a young donkey that hasn't even been really broken in. Matthew Henry's commentary is so rich and perceptive here. He notes that this king specifically chose a beast of burden, an animal that Henry describes as a poor, silly, and contemptible one in the eyes of military men.
Right.
To visually, viscerally demonstrate that true kingdom power is of a completely different nature. It is spiritual, it is foundational, and it is absolutely not based on carnal weapons or brute force.
And the text proves this immediately. The very next verse, verse 10, says, "I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations."
So wait, the mechanism of his rule is disarmament.
Exactly. He is coming to literally dismantle the war machine. He is taking the very symbols of aggressive, dominating power, the chariot, the war horse, the bow, and eradicating them from his own people.
Okay, wait, hold on. I'm struggling with this. I understand the poetic beauty of peace, but let's put ourselves in the shoes of the original audience.
Okay.
You are a community of returned exiles. Your walls are barely rebuilt. You have the armies of Syria, the wealth of Tyre, and the impending juggernaut of Alexander the Great looming on your horizon. Riding a donkey and cutting off your own battle bows isn't a defense strategy. It sounds like a suicide pact. Why on earth would the people accept this? If I'm living in a city surrounded by hostile, heavily armed empires, I want a ruthless general on a fire-breathing warhorse with a giant sword. I do not want a vulnerable guy on a foal speaking peace to people who want to kill me.
And your reaction is exactly why this text represents such a massive psychological obstacle to growth, both for the ancient listener and for us today. It is a highly uncomfortable, deeply countercultural idea.
Very uncomfortable.
We naturally biologically crave a warhorse leader. When our nervous systems are dysregulated by a threat, we want a leader who will crush our opposition, who will dominate the room, who will project absolute unyielding strength to make us feel safe.
That makes total sense.
We violently resist vulnerability because we equate vulnerability with death.
Exactly. We think vulnerability is just weakness waiting to be exploited.
Precisely. Yet the deep wisdom of the text insists that the chariot from Ephraim must be cut off. Why? Because of the absolute truth of human history. Fighting fire with fire only eventually burns the whole world down.
Wow.
You cannot defeat the systemic toxicity of the foolish shepherd by simply becoming a slightly more powerful, slightly more ruthless, toxic shepherd. If you use the tools of dominance to achieve peace, you just create a new empire of dominance.
Man, that's a brilliant point.
True peace, true lasting resolution, requires a radical, vulnerable paradigm shift. The king on the donkey is a total rejection of the entire operating of dominance. It's a statement that says, I will not play your game of escalation.
Let's translate this operating system to the 21st century, because we are just as guilty of this as the ancients. We live in a world that is obsessed, almost pathologically, with alpha behavior.
Hell everywhere.
We see it everywhere. We see it in aggressive corporate takeovers, in political discourse that is entirely based on destroying the opponent, in social media ecosystems where the loudest, most aggressive, most dunking voice gets the algorithmic reward.
Yeah, the dunking is constant.
We are constantly taught that to survive, you have to crush the competition. You have to be the warhorse. And right here, thousands of years ago, Zechariah introduces the ultimate anti-hustle, anti-dominance model of true success.
It is a complete redefinition of what strength actually is. True strength is enforcing everyone in the room to submit to your warhorse. Strength is having the internal fortitude, the absolute unshakable confidence to ride the donkey, to be lowly, to refuse to escalate, to speak peace into a culture that only understands war.
That is so powerful.
And Henry highlights a beautiful, almost paradoxical phrase that follows this profound image in Zechariah 9, verse 12. The text says, "Turn to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope."
Prisoners of hope. That is such a striking, almost contradictory phrase. What is the psychology behind that?
Well, think about the definition of a prisoner. A prisoner is someone who is trapped, confined by circumstances they cannot control, usually characterized by despair. They cannot escape their cell. But Zechariah tells these vulnerable, threatened people that even though they might feel physically captive to their current struggles, Their mindset makes them prisoners to something entirely different. They're bound not by chains of despair, but by the relentless expectation of this peaceful king.
Oh.
Their hope is so strong, so foundational, that they cannot escape it. They are captive to an optimistic future.
So what does this all mean for you listening today? Here is your practical how-to for this section. I want you to look at the primary conflicts in your life right now.
Good exercise.
Maybe it's a deeply toxic dynamic at the office, a bitter, ongoing argument with a spouse or family member, or maybe it's just your own relentless internal drive to succeed at all costs. Where are you relying on horses and chariots? Where are you using aggression, manipulation, loud arguments, or sheer force of will to force a resolution?
Yeah, where's the brute force?
The wisdom of Zechariah challenges you to ask, what would it actually look like to embrace lowliness in that specific situation? How can you put down the battle bow, step off the war horse, and intentionally refuse to escalate? How can you cultivate being a prisoner of hope, locked into the belief that vulnerable peace is stronger than aggressive dominance?
It requires immense courage. It requires profound emotional regulation to disarm yourself when everyone else around you is still holding a drawn sword. But according to the text, that is the only functional way to break the endless cycle of the flock of slaughter.
Which brings us to a very heavy, inevitable reality. Because intentionally disarming yourself in a hostile world has a profound cost. Vulnerability invites wounding. And this moves us into part 3, the crucible of grace.
This gets intense.
We are going to look at the mechanics of the two staffs, the horrific concept of piercing, and the necessity of the refining fire.
We need to return to Zechariah chapter 11. We talked earlier about the foolish shepherd, the one who consumes the flock. But before that, the prophet Zechariah is commanded to symbolically act out the role of the good shepherd, the one who tries to save them.
Okay.
To do this, he takes 2 physical tools. He takes 2 staffs.
Like the classic wooden shepherd's crooks used to guide and protect the sheep.
Exactly. But these staffs are highly symbolic. They represent the structural integrity of the society. He names one staff favor, or in some translations, beauty. He names the second staff union, or bands.
Favor and union.
Matthew Henry explains the mechanics of this symbolism vividly. The staff of favor represents the beautiful, protective covenant of grace between God and the people. It is the vertical relationship.
Got it.
The staff of union represents the brotherhood, the social cohesion, and the unity between the people themselves, specifically the historically divided kingdoms of Judah and Israel. This is the horizontal relationship.
Okay, so you have divine connection on one axis and human connection on the other. Vertical harmony and horizontal harmony. The structural pillars of a healthy society.
Yes. But the tragedy of the narrative is that the flock entirely rejects the good shepherd. The text says their soul was grieved with him, and he loathed them. The relationship completely breaks down.
Oh, no.
And so the shepherd breaks both staffs. First, he physically snaps the staff of favor, signifying the breaking of the divine covenant, the removal of that overarching protection, and then the ultimate calculated insult takes place.
Here is where it gets really interesting. This is the moment I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Right.
The shepherd basically says, look, if you don't want my leadership, if you reject the peace I'm offering, fine. Pay me my wages, settle my account, and let's be done. And what does the society value his leadership at? Zechariah says, so they weighed for my wages 30 pieces of silver.
Which is absolutely not just a random amount of money.
No. It is a mathematically precise insult. Matthew Henry points out, drawing from the book of Exodus, that 30 pieces of silver was the exact legal compensation price for a slave who was accidentally gored to death by an ox.
Just brutal.
It was the absolute floor of human economic value in the ancient world. It wasn't just a low wage, it was a statement. It was the society saying, after all your care, after all your protection, we value your life and your leadership exactly as much as a piece of dead, damaged property.
Yeah.
It is the lowest possible rung of societal worth.
And God's response to the prophet is dripping with divine sarcasm. God says, throw it to the potter. The handsome price that I was valued at by them. It's such a paltry, insulting sum, you might as well toss it to a common craftsman making cheap, disposable clay pots in the field.
And historically, the resonance here is staggering. As Henry notes, centuries later, 30 pieces of silver is the exact specific sum that Judas Iscariot is paid by the religious leaders to betray Jesus, the ultimate king on a donkey. And what do the leaders eventually do with that blood money? They literally use it to buy a potter's field to bury strangers in. The echo across history is chilling.
It really is. And we have to look at the immediate sociological consequence of this rejection. Because immediately after the 30 pieces of silver are thrown to the potter, the shepherd breaks the second staff, union.
Horizontal one.
Because the absolute rule of human sociology is this: once the staff of favor is broken, once a society loses its connection to a shared, transcendent grace or higher moral purpose, human brotherhood immediately fractures.
That makes a lot of sense.
The text says it breaks the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Without that centralizing, peaceful, vertical leadership, the horizontal society immediately devolves into factionalism, polarization, and vicious infighting.
We see the mechanics of that every single day in our modern world, don't we? When a culture loses its overarching sense of grace, when we lose a shared higher narrative, the staff of union snaps.
Yeah.
We immediately fracture into hyper-aggressive tribalism, and everyone turns on each other. We become our own flock of slaughter. But the brilliance of Zechariah is that he doesn't end the story with a permanently broken society. There is a massive turning point, and it is found in chapter 12.
Chapter 12 represents a dramatic, almost violent shift in the narrative. Jerusalem becomes what the text calls a cup of reeling and a burdensome stone to all the nations that try to attack it.
What does that mean?
The imagery is of people trying to lift a boulder that is way too heavy, and anyone who tries to lift it will be severely injured, literally tearing their own muscles. God is stepping in to unilaterally defend the vulnerable.
Wow.
But the most transformative insight in this entire book, perhaps one of the most profound psychological insights in ancient literature, doesn't happen on a physical battlefield. It happens internally, inside the human heart.
Yes, verse 10. This is the pivot of the entire text. God says, I will pour on David's house and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. They will look to me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and will grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for his firstborn.
This is the crucible. God promises to pour out a spirit of grace.
Wait, I need to stop and really wrestle with this concept. I think modern listeners will be very confused here. When we think of the word grace, we think of relief.
Yeah, lightness.
We think of a governor calling at the last minute to issue a pardon. Grace is supposed to make people happy. It makes them feel light, forgiven, unburdened. But here, the text explicitly says that the direct, immediate result of receiving the spirit of grace is that they will look at the one they have pierced and they will weep bitterly. They will mourn like they've lost a child. Why on earth would an infusion of divine grace cause such intense, agonizing, almost suicidal sorrow? That sounds like a punishment, not a gift.
Because true, unadulterated grace is fundamentally illuminating. Matthew Henry's commentary provides a profound psychological insight into the mechanism of grace here.
What does he say?
He explains that before you can ever experience the joyful, relieving aspect of grace, grace first acts as a blinding spotlight. It illuminates our own absolute complicity in the brokenness of the world.
Oh.
When the people finally receive this spirit of grace, they look at the Good Shepherd, the one they undervalued at 30 pieces of silver, the one they pierced. And the grace strips away all their cognitive dissonance. It destroys their self-justification. They suddenly realize they are the ones holding the bloody spear.
Oh, wow. So they can no longer blame their problems on the Babylonians or the Syrians or the geopolitical landscape. The victim narrative evaporates.
Exactly. Zechariah 13 verse 6 even expands on this piercing. It asks, what are these wounds between your arms? And the answer is, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends.
In the house of my friends. Wow.
The mourning isn't just a generic sadness about the state of the world. The mourning comes from the crushing, highly specific realization that they wounded their ultimate friend. They actively destroyed the very thing that was trying to save them.
Yeah.
It is a universal mourning that spreads across the entire land, but the text emphasizes that it is deeply personal. It says every family apart. You cannot grieve this in a crowd. You can't outsource this repentance. You have to face your own individual, inescapable guilt.
That is incredibly heavy. It is the absolute death of the ego, but it's also the only functional path to real systemic change.
Exactly.
Because of this realization, because they are finally willing to engage in this deep, honest, personal mourning, Chapter 13 says a fountain is opened for sin and for uncleanness. The systemic rot is finally addressed, the idols are banished, the false prophets are driven out. But getting to that fountain requires walking through an inferno.
Zechariah 13 introduces the mechanism of the refining fire. Verse 9 says, I will bring the third part into the fire and will refine them as silver is refined and will test them like gold is tested.
Let's really look at the metallurgy of that imagery, because it explains so much about human suffering. When a silversmith refines silver, you can't just wipe the dirt off the surface.
Oh, it's baked in.
Right. The impurities are molecularly bound to the metal. You have to put the silver into a crucible and subject it to incredibly high, sustained heat. The heat physically melts the metal, breaking down its structural integrity so that all the dross, all the toxic impurities are forced to rise to the surface where the silversmith can skim them away.
It's a violent process.
It's a violent, destructive, terrifying process for the silver, but it is the literal only way to get a pure reflection.
And Henry connects this metallurgical process to the trials and sufferings necessary for deep spiritual and psychological purification. The text says, "Awake, sword, against my shepherd. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered."
Yeah.
The refining process involves extreme loss, profound disorientation, and immense heat. It is not a gentle self-improvement program. But look at the promised result.
What happens after?
After the fire has done its work, God says, "It is my people," and they respond, "The Lord is my God." The vertical relationship, the staff of favor that was snapped back in chapter 11, is finally fully restored. But it absolutely had to go through the fire of truth to get there.
So what does this all mean for you? Here is your practical reflection for this deeply challenging section. In our modern self-help culture, we are constantly, desperately looking for the life hack to avoid pain.
Oh, constant life hacks.
We want the shortcut to peace. We want the 5-step morning routine that prevents us from ever feeling guilty. But the ancient wisdom of Zechariah says that true, enduring personal growth requires the painful fire of total self-awareness. We cannot be healed until we are brave enough to look directly at what we have pierced.
That's beautifully said.
What relationships have you damaged through your own pride? What good things, what good people have you undervalued at 30 pieces of silver? Where are you holding the spear?
We have to stop running from the heat. The question for the listener is, what refiner's fire are you walking through right now? Perhaps it's a massive failure at work, a deeply painful crisis in your marriage, or a quiet, terrifying personal reckoning with your own character flaws.
Right.
Instead of trying to escape the heat immediately or blaming external forces to protect your ego, how can you yield to the process? How can you let the heat break down your pride and burn away the dross? How can you let this agonizing realization reveal your true, purified character?
It's about enduring the crucible and letting the fire do its necessary work. And if you can survive that fire, if society can survive that realization, Zechariah promises an outcome that is genuinely, completely mind-bending.
Which brings us to our final section, part 4. The cosmic climax and the eradication of the sacred and secular divide.
We arrive at chapter 14. This is the apocalyptic crescendo of the entire book.
It really reads like the final act of a massive, big-budget sci-fi epic. The imagery is absolutely cosmic in scale. Zechariah paints a picture where all nations are gathered against Jerusalem for one final cataclysmic battle. From a human perspective, it looks like the absolute end. The city is taken, the houses are rifled. But then the Lord goes out to fight. And verse 4 contains an image that shatters the geographic and theological world. It says, "His feet will stand in that day on the Mount of Olives," which is before Jerusalem on the east. "And the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, making a very great valley. Half of the mountain will move toward the north, and half of it toward the south."
It's a geological event of literal earth-shattering proportions. The mountain physically tears in half to create an escape route, a massive valley for the besieged people to flee through.
But Matthew Henry's analysis of this splitting mountain is what elevates this from a cool special effect to a profound theological paradigm shift.
Okay, how so?
He doesn't just view it as an earthquake. He views it as a sociological revolution. The Mount of Olives physically stood between Jerusalem and the outside Gentile world. It blocked the view.
Ah, I see.
By splitting the mountain in half, God is symbolically tearing down the massive, ancient partition wall between Jews and Gentiles. He is taking the enclosed, highly exclusive, walled-off fortress of ancient religion and blowing the walls wide open, creating a broad, level, universally accessible valley of communication and admission for the entire world.
The exclusivity of the system is destroyed. The gates are permanently stuck open to everyone, and the fate of the enemies who try to stop this universal opening is horrific. We have to briefly mention verse 12, where it details the plague on those who fight against Jerusalem.
Oh, this part is rough.
It says, "Their flesh will consume away while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will consume away in their sockets, and their tongues in their mouths." It's a terrifying, almost zombie-like picture.
Very Walking Dead.
Right. But it's a metaphor for the internal rot of those who fight against this ultimate reality of grace. It's almost like they become the Walking Dead, entirely consumed by their own hatred and panic.
Yes. The text mentions a great panic from the Lord where they turn their hands against each other. It is the ultimate, inevitable self-destruction of evil. It cannibalizes itself.
But the narrative doesn't linger on the horror, thankfully.
No, it doesn't. The text immediately pivots from this nightmare to an image of incredible, abounding, unstoppable life. Verse 8 says, "It will happen in that day that living waters will go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and half of them toward the western sea. It will be so in summer and in winter."
Living waters. In the ancient Near East, water was life. But these aren't stagnant pools or cisterns that can run dry. These are flowing, dynamic rivers of life, going in every direction, reaching the ends of the earth. The text declares that the Lord becomes king over all the earth.
Yeah.
But what I really want to zero in on are the stunning, completely unexpected final verses of this book. Because after all this high-stakes talk of cosmic battles, splitting mountains, walking plagues, and global rivers, Zechariah ends his massive prophetic work talking about horses and cooking pots.
I mean, it seems like a strange, mundane anticlimax if you aren't paying close attention to the mechanics of what he's saying.
Right. Let's read the exact text. Verse 20. "In that day there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord, and the pots in the Lord's house will be like the bowls before the altar. Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of armies."
This is where we find a profound comparative insight that echoes across human history. Many global wisdom traditions, whether it's Zen Buddhism, modern mindfulness practices, or various Eastern philosophies, seek to erase the psychological line between the sacred and the secular.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. The ultimate goal of those practices is to find the divine in the present moment, in the everyday, sweeping the floor action. Zechariah is arriving at that exact same ultimate human truth through his apocalyptic prophetic vision.
Let's break down the significance of the bells of the horses. Throughout this entire book, the horse has been a symbol of war, of empire, of human arrogance, and of dominance.
Right, the war horse.
But now the bells on their harness, which were just everyday secular items used to guide the animal or make noise, are inscribed with the phrase, "Holy to the Lord." Now, to an ancient Israelite, those specific words were incredibly restricted.
Highly restricted.
They used to only be engraved on the solid gold plate worn on the forehead of the high priest, who was the only person allowed inside the most restricted, exclusive, terrifyingly holy part of the temple, and only once a year.
Exactly. Matthew Henry emphasizes the mechanism here. Real holiness has become completely diffused. It has escaped containment.
It's out in the open.
It is no longer locked away behind a veil in a physical temple. It's no longer restricted to a specific elite caste of priests or a specific holy day of the calendar year. The very instruments of war, commerce, and everyday transportation are fundamentally transformed and repurposed for divine service.
And the cooking pots. The text says the ordinary soot-stained pots that common people use to boil their lentil stew for dinner will be as holy as the sacred, meticulously crafted golden bowls used by the priests to catch the blood of the sacrifices before the altar.
It's a total flattening.
Every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy. There is no more hierarchy of objects. There is no more hierarchy of spaces.
The profound human truth being revealed here is that the mundane is completely infused with the divine. The sacred and secular divide is entirely eradicated.
I love that.
You don't have to go to a special, architecturally impressive building to encounter the sacred. The sacred is sitting on your kitchen stove. It's in the tools of your daily trade. The ordinary, repetitive actions of human life, cooking a meal for your family, traveling to your job, sweeping the floor, are elevated to acts of ultimate worship and meaning.
That is beautiful.
Henry notes beautifully that when we eat and drink, we aren't just biologically fueling our mammalian bodies. We are partaking in a sacred divine reality if our hearts have been aligned with that spirit of grace we talked about earlier.
So here is your final, incredibly practical how-to for this deep dive. As modern people, we are so guilty of compartmentalizing our lives. We build our own little partitions.
We all do it.
We have our holy hour, maybe it's a Sunday morning church service or a 20-minute guided meditation app session on the train or a yoga class where we actively try to be centered, spiritual, and connected to meaning. And then we close that box and we enter the secular box.
The work week.
The hustle of the work week where it's dog eat dog, full of stress, anxiety, spreadsheets, and traffic. We keep the sacred and the secular in completely separate, quarantined boxes.
But the apocalyptic vision of Zechariah says those boxes have been destroyed. The mountain has been split. The walls are gone.
Exactly. So your practice for this week is this. I want you to intentionally treat your next incredibly mundane task as an act of ultimate cosmic meaning.
That's a great challenge.
When you are standing at the sink washing your literal cooking pots tonight, or when you are sitting in gridlock driving your car, which is your modern horse to work tomorrow morning, do not view it as empty, secular, frustrating time that you just have to grit your teeth and get through.
View it as entirely sacred.
Let that inscription, holy to the Lord, ring in your mind with every single email you send, every mundane meal you prep, every casual interaction you have with a cashier. Because if the mundane is truly sacred, then your entire life is an unbroken holy event. There is no wasted time.
It changes the entire geometry of how you live. It completely strips away that modern nagging anxiety of feeling like you aren't doing enough important things with your life, because you realize the ordinary things are the most important things.
It really does. It reframes existence. Well, we have covered massive sweeping ground today. We've navigated the chaotic, terrifying politics of the ancient Near East. We've dissected the extractive psychology of the toxic, foolish shepherd.
We've wrestled with the highly uncomfortable vulnerability of a king arriving on a donkey. We've talked about the necessity of surviving the painful refining fire of self-awareness. And finally, we've looked at the beautiful eradication of the sacred and the secular.
And all of these complex threads, all of these historical and psychological realities loop back perfectly to that central, life-giving promise of the living waters flowing out from the city.
Yes, the living waters. And that brings us to one final, deeply provocative thought to leave you with as you go about your week. Think back to Zechariah 14, verse 8.
Right.
It explicitly states that those living waters will flow in summer and in winter. Now, in the geography of the ancient Middle East, that is a miracle. Normal rivers, seasonal streams called wadis, dried up completely in the scorching summer heat, and they froze or slowed to a trickle in the dead of winter.
They were entirely dependent on external circumstances.
But these waters never, ever stop. So I want you to consider this. If the living waters of grace, meaning, and connection are flowing in the bright, successful, easy summer seasons of your life, and the text promises they're still flowing just as powerfully in the cold, desolate, failing winter seasons of your despair, how does that change the way you view the current dry spells in your own life?
What if the water of meaning is flowing right now, even in your darkest winter, but you're just looking in the wrong, dried-up riverbed?
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.